was slippery. It cut through the wind like a hot knife through butter. It had a very big engine, an engine that would run on the red line all day. And it was made for one purpose, to chase the mighty Dodge and Plymouth Hemi cars off the high banks of America's stock car tracks. Ford even gave it a name which conjured up images of unreal speeds: Talladega. The Torino Talladega was the last word in Ford Motor Company's high-performance development during the unlimited horsepower wars of the 60s. The Talladega and its cousin, the Mercury Cyclone Spoiler II, were capable of running over 200 miles an hour on the high-bank stock car tracks. Their aerodynamic front ends and their fastback roofline gave them a clear advantage over their arch rivals, the Dodges and Plymouths. In 1969, with the all-new Boss 429 engine under the hoods, the Ford and Mercury teams simply walked away from the feared Chrysler Hemis. Tim Wellborn has strong memories of the battles between Ford and Chrysler.
Ford came in and they were behind maybe a little bit, but they came with an arrow nose on their car, and they went faster. So what happened? Chrysler had to counter, so they came with a Daytona and a Superbird, and kind of one-upped on that. And pretty soon it got pretty wild. In fact, these cars got too fast too quick.
Ford didn't build the Talladega because they wanted to see one in every driveway in America. The Talladega was simply a 600 horsepower sales tool. Ford. Chances are, if you had gone to your local Ford dealer in the summer of 1969 and asked for a test ride in a Talladega, there wouldn't have been one on his lot. Instead, your salesman would have offered you a ride in one of these: a 1969 Torino GT with a high-performance 390, or this Fairlane Cobra with a fearsome 428 Cobra jet mill, or a half-dozen other incredible rides that were sitting in his showroom. Every model was an ultimate street machine, except for the Talladega. The Talladega was made for the racetracks. The Torino Talladega was the latest in a long line of fast Fords, which traced its ancestry back to this car, the 1956 Fairlane. Through the years, the Fairlane had seen duty as Ford's top-of-the-line beauty, an economy car, and a mega-motored muscle car. In its ultimate evolution as the Torino Talladega, it ushered in a new era of aerodynamic performance, and it revolutionized stock car racing. The story of the Fairlane and the Talladega is a big chapter in the story of stock car racing and Ford's involvement in racing for a quarter century. So we'll start our story where it all began, when the American muscle car returns. In the mid-50s, stock car racing was becoming a high-visibility, high-dollar sport. There was a connection between winning and selling, and Ford understood this connection better than anyone else. About this time, Ford became aware of two gentlemen who would become very important to their racing future: John Holman and Ralph Moody. Lee Holman remembers how his father John first teamed up with Ford to build race cars.
Ford had a racing team in Charlotte that was Peter DiPaolo Engineering, but they weren't very successful. And they looked around for a manager, and my father was working for Bill Stropp at the time in California. And they offered him the job to come out to the East Coast and become the team manager. And the cars were instantly successful. They started winning every race they went to.
In 1956, factory Fords won 27 convertible races and another 13 wins in the hardtop division with the all-new Fairlane. The next year, the Fairlane achieved the most important corporate milestone of all. It outsold the '57 Chevy by over 150,000 cars. Even an agreement by the major automakers to curtail their racing activity did little to stop the growth of racing.
General Motors lobbied to have all the manufacturers get out of racing. And so late in '57, they withdrew, Ford Motor Company, GM, and Chrysler all withdrew factory support.
But most people didn't care if the factories were involved or not. They just wanted to watch fast cars race. And they wanted to buy the cars that won the race.
Ford durability wins again in open competition.
By 1963, everything was going Ford's way. Despite furious competition from Dodge and Plymouth, Fords took the first 5 positions in the 1963 Daytona 500. The silver bullet that propelled these cars was the latest and greatest in a long line of Ford super engines, the high-riser 427. This bulletproof power plant would be the engine to beat for nearly a decade of stock car racing. Ford needed every ounce of horsepower it could get right now. Its race cars were starting to get a little beefy.
In the early 60s, Ford had some pretty big cars. I don't know if you've gone back and seen a 62 or a 63 Galaxy. That's a fairly big brick to push through the air.
The Galaxy weighed in at 4,150 pounds, and it was about as aerodynamic as a school bus. While it was still the fastest thing on the track, thanks to Ford's awesome engines, it was becoming clear that unless the cars went on a diet, they were going to run out of horsepower. To find that extra speed, the race teams called up an old warhorse, the Fairlane. The Fairlane had been plodding along in Ford's lineup as an economy car for the past few years. But in 1966, Ford gave it new life as a tire-burning muscle car. The NASCAR boys were delighted to find that this excellent street muscle car was also a very good race car. All through 1967, the search for more speed was keeping Ford's racers busy. More speed wasn't going to come from under the hood. It was going to come out of the wind tunnel. Stay with us as NASCAR racers cheat the win when the American muscle car returns. There was a new word in the racing lexicon in 1968, fastback. If you weren't racing one, you lost. Fastback roof lines flowed gently from the windshield to the rear deck. Smooth airflow over this part of the car was critical for handling and speed. The 1968 Fairlane Torino was a textbook fastback. In this new aerodynamic world, more speed depended on your ability to punch a smaller hole in the wind. With one look at this car, the race car builders knew they could make it run over 180 miles per hour on the high bank tracks. NASCAR legend Ralph Moody has been an innovator in race car building for over 50 years. His work with fastback roof lines gave Ford a push in the right direction.
We had guys down there that was good with sheet metal and all that stuff, and I'd been talking to Ford about having a fastback car, you know, and to start with they had a notchback, and they thought that was thing would be the one that run the fastest. For some reason they thought that, and I said, well, you know, that ain't going to be the way it is. It's going to be the, you know, fastback that runs. And we made the first one, and we took that thing over to this executive building out front and had some of the Ford people come out and look at it. Boy, they liked that. You know, that was the first one they had. I drove it over there, and that's what started the aerodynamic stuff in the Torino and the Talladega.
The Torino had a distinct aero advantage over the '68 Plymouth Roadrunner and the Dodge Charger. David Pearson captured his 3rd NASCAR championship in a '68 Torino. And for the Blue Oval team, stock car racing was fun again.
I always tried to, you know, take care of the equipment. I've always heard build them light and turn them tight, you know, so that's what I always tried to do.
In May of 1968, NASCAR broke ground for a new super speedway. It would be 2.66 miles long with 41-degree bank turns. The track was located in a little Alabama town called Talladega. At about the same time, taking shape in Holman and Moody's race shop was a Torino that might just run 200 miles per hour on this new super speedway. Talladega sounded like a pretty good name for this new car.
We developed the long-nosed Talladega front end just to aerodynamically get the car through the wind quicker. The back half of a Talladega is pretty much a standard car, but the front half was highly modified just for aerodynamics.
The Torino Talladega had "Race Me" stamped all over it. Every aerodynamic trick in the book was built into the car, from the flat rear glass to the longer front fenders and flush grille. What they didn't have, they created on the spot.
We made all the nose pieces and all. We had a machine to just press that stuff up. And it made a nice car out of it.
Ford also decided that the Talladega was the perfect platform for their new Boss 429 semi-Hemi engine. Before they could race this car, though, Ford had to convince NASCAR that the Torino Talladega and the Boss 429 engine were standard production items.
Everybody goes on today how many, there was 500 built, and never was. They say there was, but there never was.
Somehow, Ford's handful of hand-built Talladegas satisfied NASCAR. But certifying the Boss 429 engine required a little creativity. 500 1969 Mustangs were stuffed with the Boss 429 engine. And these were paraded before the NASCAR brass as proof that the Boss was an over-the-counter piece. It was thin, but hey, this was stock car racing. Meanwhile, out on the street, the muscle car crowd was feeling the effects of all this racing R&D. We'll check out the street action when the American muscle car returns. Out on the street, the muscle car wars were in full swing, and they were every bit as hot as the war on the track. Ford's racing had resulted in some pretty incredible street cars that looked like, and more importantly, performed like their stock car heroes. One of America's most popular muscle cars was the Fairlane GT. It had been maintaining the blue oval reputation for bad boy street cars. It was gorgeous. It had all the neat muscle car amenities, and it was fairly quick with a 390 Hypo engine. But when they needed a little more, Ford reached back and grabbed a lot more. The legendary 427.
The 427 was a nice engine. The medium riser was the one I prefer. It's what's in my car, but it's a nice, mild, drivable engine with so much torque that you can just twist the axles off of a car.
Muscle cars were fun, but racing dictated what was cool on the street. By 1969, the fastback Torino was extremely cool. Muscle car fans were finding out that big horsepower and sexy styling didn't have to come at the expense of comfort and roominess.
Well, I wanted a big block. It was nice to get a big block car, feeling the low-end torque in that. And the body style is nice. It's big enough, but it's not too big. And it has a decent ride for the cars of that era because of the wheelbase.
The Fairlane and its upmarket brother, the Torino, sold over 200,000 units in 1969. And somewhere in that total were a few truckloads of street Talladegas. Maybe your daddy was a Ford dealer. Maybe you lived down the street from Mr. Holman or Mr. Moody. Or maybe you were just lucky. Those were about the only ways you were even going to get a look at the Talladega, much less get your hands on one. The street Talladegas came equipped with Ford's most fearsome street motor, the 335 horsepower Cobra Jet 428. This engine used the super strong 427 block and had a bore of 4.13 inches and a stroke of 3.98 inches. Other goodies included a forged crankshaft, police interceptor connecting rods, forged pistons, and a 481 lift hydraulic camshaft. The CJ made its horsepower with a 10.7 to 1 compression ratio and a Holley 735 carburetor on a cast iron intake manifold.
The Torino Talladega for sale.
It was less exotic than the racing Boss 429, but on the street, it was the perfect muscle car power plant. The street Talladega was an off-the-rack car. You had your choice of 3 colors: Royal Maroon, Presidential Blue, or Wimbledon White. Only one transmission was available, the C6 automatic. And in classic Ford style, you had your choice of interior colors, as long as it was black. You got all this for $3,685, about what you'd pay for a totally decked out Torino GT. But Ford never intended to sell many Talladegas. Not that they had that many to sell anyway. In fact, the fewer Talladegas Ford sold, the more they had to send to the racing teams, which incidentally were doing quite well with them out on the track. We'll check back in with the stock car boys when the American muscle car returns. Going to be a good racing year for Ford. How good a year? Even Richard Petty, Plymouth's shining star, was driving at Talladega this year.
Well, I've been trying to lick them. I just decided I'd join them.
Ford opened the season by winning at Riverside and Daytona, but midway through '69, Mopar fired back. Out of their wind tunnel rolled a new shape which stopped everyone, especially the Ford contingent, right in their tracks. Dodge called it Daytona, and it was their 200-mile-per-hour trump card. Outrageous didn't begin to describe it. Where the Talladega's nose drooped, the Daytona's pointed. The Talladega had a little spoiler on the rear deck. This car had an entire wing stuck way up in the airstream. Up and down pit row, the Ford drivers watched and hoped Dodge's gimmick wouldn't work. David Pearson, who was driving at Talladega again that year, was one of the skeptics.
We felt like that little wing they had way up there, like it wouldn't do that much good, but we was wrong. It really did, and it held the car down, more downforce. They could set the angle of it, you know, and get as much spoiler as they wanted.
The Dodge Daytona worked fine on the high banks, and Mopar was back in the hunt for the NASCAR championship. All through the '69 season, the Hemi-powered Dodges and the 429 Fords swapped the lead. But when the points were tallied, David Pearson had won his third driving championship in his Talladega. Ford finished the 1969 season with 26 wins to Dodge's 22. And privately, some in NASCAR wondered how much higher these speeds could get. The answer was not much higher. Going into 1970, there were a lot of weird shapes in the NASCAR garages. The battle lines were drawn for the fastest season in NASCAR history. When the Talladega, the Daytona, and the new Plymouth Superbird started lapping the big bank tracks at over 200 miles per hour, the tire companies, the drivers, and NASCAR agreed that things might be getting out of hand. So in a decision based on driver safety, NASCAR applied the brakes. With one move, they slowed the cars down and leveled the playing field at the same time with a device which governs racing competition to this day, the carburetor restrictor plate.
So we put the restrictor plates on to slow them down, and the whole idea was to get them out of the 210 range, to get them back down to 190-mile-an-hour bracket. And I think it was a very, very wise idea.
The plate not only lowered big track speeds, it signaled the death of the ultra-exotic race engines, like the Hemi and the Boss 429. At the same time, the rules change imposed huge weight penalties on the Talladega and the other aero cars. After 1970, there would be no more pointy noses, trick wings, or special race engines. NASCAR would race into its next era in lighter cars with smaller engines. The 1970 season was the final chapter in stock car racing's golden age. The world was changing in 1971, and high-performance cars were under attack from all sides. Big public corporations spending millions of dollars on racing was about as politically incorrect as you could get.
Ford had won everything that it could win. It had won Le Mans with the GT40s twice, and it had won Daytona so many times it was silly. It had won Darlington and Charlotte and all of that. We basically owned the racing world. But Henry Ford was called before Congress, and one of the senators or congressmen, whoever was in front of, said, well, you're spending millions of dollars in racing. Maybe if you took some of that money and put it towards economy, that you would have a better thing. And so Henry Ford said, we no longer race.
In fact, we was in California testing at the time, and Ford man, Charlie Gray, was there, and he come up and said, well, said Ford just quit racing, just pulled out of racing. And of course, they just quit, stopped the test right then and loaded up and come on back home.
When Ford pulled the plug on its factory racing efforts in 1971, it ended 25 years of the most intense high-performance research and development ever undertaken by an auto manufacturer. Ford's pullout also ended work on this car, the King Cobra, which was to be the next step beyond the Talladega. Only 3 of these cars were ever made, and 2 survive today. Thanks to the restorers, a handful of these factory race cars still exist to bring back memories of stock car racing's first golden age. Today's stock cars are running almost 200 miles per hour on safer tracks with better tires, driven by people too young to remember the big boss 429 Fords. But race fans everywhere owe a lot to the Talladega, those who built them and those who drove them. They did a lot to make stock car racing the greatest afternoon of entertainment in the world.
When you put 40 of these cars out on the racetrack, running right at, like Daytona and Talladega, running right in the mud, running right at 200 miles an hour, now that is a show.
Thanks for watching, and please remember, don't crush them, restore them.